In the Montana forest, where wilderness meets solitude, Alex, a compassionate man, noticed a wild bobcat cub regularly appearing near his home. Living in a remote cabin surrounded by towering pines and endless silence, Alex had sought the quiet after the loss of his wife 4 years ago, raising his teenage son Adam alone. The grief had settled into the bones of the cabin, into the floorboards and the windowsills, but so had a kind of peace and understanding that life would go unchanged, quieter, but still worth living. Wildlife had always been part of the backdrop here, with elk migrating through in early spring, black bears overturning logs near the stream, and the occasional coyote howl piercing the cold night air. But the appearance of the lone bobcat cub was different. It was young, likely, recently separated from its mother, and moved with the kind of hesitance that came from both inexperience and recent hardship. Alex first spotted it at the edge of his property, just beyond the gravel driveway that curved into the woods one chilly October morning. The mist still clung low over the forest floor, and the air smelled of damp pine needles and woods. He was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee when he saw movement near a stand of aspen. The cub emerged slowly, its fur dusky brown with faint rosettes along the legs and shoulders, its face triangular and sharp, with wide golden eyes. Those eyes met Alex's across the quiet distance, both still, both unsure. The cub's ears flicked, and it lowered its body, not in threat, but caution. Alex didn't move. He simply watched. He had learned over years of living close to nature that patience was often rewarded, and that the wild would reveal itself to those who respected its rhythm. The cub lingered a minute, then disappeared into the underbrush. That moment might have been forgotten, written off as a rare sighting, except the cub returned the next morning, and the next, always around dawn, always at the same spot. Would emerge from the trees, pace the edge of the clearing, then vanish. He didn't speak to it at first, just observed. Each time he sat still on the porch, not even raising his camera. The cub watched him too from a distance, its tail low, its movements careful, but not erratic. It had an intensity to its gaze, not wild rage or fear, but watchfulness measuring him. On the fourth morning, Alex noticed something that worried him. The cub was growing thinner. The flanks that had once seemed filled out now curved inward slightly, and its gait lacked energy. He scanned the tree for signs of another bobcat, perhaps a mother, but there was nothing. No movement, no tracks near the chicken coop, no scat. That night, against his better judgment, Alex left out a small portion of raw chicken on a flat rock, near the base of a pine at the edge of the clearing. He knew it wasn't encouraged to feed wild animals. He'd interviewed biologists, read articles, even written grant proposals for conservation efforts. But the memory of the cub's eyes lingered. He reasoned it was a small gesture, a temporary help. The cub clearly wasn't doing well. He watched from the window after sunset, but nothing came. By dawn, the meat was gone. He examined the ground. The snow had fallen lightly overnight, and the tracks leading to and from the rock matched the small oval padded paws of a bobcat. He tried again the next evening, spacing out the feedings. He left slightly smaller pieces at different intervals, hoping not to create expectation, but the cub returned. Not every night, but enough to suggest a pattern. Over time, he noticed something unexpected. The cub didn't slink away. The moment Alex stepped onto the porch, sometimes it paused to watch him. Longer. Once it sat down, tail curled around its paws, and looked across the clearing toward the cabin. Alex, heart beating fast, didn't move. He just nodded as though that would somehow communicate that he meant no harm. He didn't name the cub, didn't speak aloud, didn't try to get closer, but he began sketching it in his notebook, describing its appearance in his journal, writing down the weather, the time, the direction it came from. And the cub, too, seemed to develop its own understanding. It didn't approach the cabin, didn't scratch or mewl, but it didn't flee, either. One morning, Alex left the chicken on the rock and stepped back, remaining outside. The cub emerged, slowly as always, but this time it ate, while Alex stood within view. No glass or walls between them. It chewed quickly, alert, then licked its paw and retreated. That moment shifted something. The next day, the same. There was no approach, no taming, but something passed between them in the stillness of the forest, recognition. Without domestication, Alex began keeping a journal, sketching the cub, and jotting down observations. He noted that its visits became more regular as the snow began to fall. First, he recorded just the time of arrival, the direction the cub came from, and its behavior, whether it sat, paced, or darted nervously. He used a set of old binoculars to observe from a distance, careful not to disturb the creature's routine. The cub's shape was beginning to fill out slightly, but its ribs still showed on days when the morning light hit just right. It would often pause by the same pine tree near the edge of the clearing, ears twitching at every bird call or distant crack of branches. One day, Alex noticed it, limping slightly on the left front paw, but by the next visit, the limp was gone. In the margins of his notebook, he began to note things he hadn't expected. The exact pitch of the cub's low throat chirp, the way it poured at the snow before eating, how it sometimes glanced up at the cabin before retreating. By the second week of November, the cub was arriving nearly every other day. Snow had settled permanently on the mountains by then, blanketing the trees and flattening the underbrush. The air was quieter, too, muffled under the weight of winter. Was during this period of careful observation that Alex noticed something that made him freeze midnight. Through the binoculars, he spotted a second set of prints, not far behind the first. First, he thought they were his own from the previous day, but these were fresh, smaller, lighter. He scanned the clearing and spotted only the older cub. It approached the food cautiously, paused to sniff the ground, then turned sharply as though checking behind it. But nothing followed. He noticed the same pattern again. Two sets of tracks, this time clearer. One pair was slightly staggered, like one animal had hesitated or struggled to keep pace. He didn't see the second animal until several days later. It was just a glimpse, a tiny form trailing behind the older cub, nearly lost in the drifts of snow. Moved slowly, its head bobbing low, its frame hardly larger than a house cat. The older cub paused, turned back, waited, then both disappeared behind a fallen log. That moment haunted Alex all day. He replayed it in his head as he split wood, stirred the soup, and later stood silently on the porch. The idea wouldn't leave him. A protector, a sibling, not a mother. That realization changed everything. This wasn't a young mother with a single kid. It was a slightly older cub, barely managing on his own, now caring for a much younger sibling. Alex could scarcely believe it. In all his years observing wildlife, he had never seen such behavior. Bobcats were solitary by nature. Cubs stayed with their mothers for several months before venturing off alone. But here, somehow, this young cat had taken on a responsibility far beyond what nature expected of him, and the weight of that was visible in every cautious glance, every stop-and-wait step across the snow. That night, over a dinner of venison stew and warm bread, Alex brought it up to Adam. "They're not just surviving," he said, setting down his spoon. "They're protecting each other. That older one, he's just a kid himself, but he's doing his best." Adam, now 16, had heard countless stories from his father's notebooks. Wolves tracking elk, deer fights in early rut, the silent passing of a fox in the frost. But this time, he leaned forward. "Do you think they'll make it through the winter?" His voice was low, unsure. "I hope so," Alex answered. He didn't say what he was really thinking, that the odds were long. A healthy bobcat might survive a Montana winter, but two young cubs, alone, vulnerable, one barely strong enough to walk. The margin for error was thin. As December deepened, the sky stayed gray and heavy for days at a time, the sun rising late and falling early. The snow didn't melt between storms anymore. Alex decided he couldn't just hope. He built a small shelter from spare wood in the shed, repurposing some of the leftover timber from when he and Adam had reinforced the barn roof. The structure wasn't much. 3 sturdy walls, a sloped roof to shed snow, and a wide enough base to allow a bobcat to lie inside comfortably. He lined the bottom with dry straw and wedged it near the edge of the clearing, camouflaged slightly by low shrubs and overhanging pine branches. He didn't want to spook the cubs, and he didn't want the structure to attract other predators or scavengers. No food was placed inside. Instead, he continued to set small offerings nearby, never at predictable intervals, still maintaining the boundary between assistance and interference. The shelter remained untouched for days. Then one early morning he found paw prints leading inside. When he looked again in the afternoon, the straw had been rearranged. Someone had curled up there. And then the storm came. It started with an icy wind that swept down from the northern range, dragging clouds that hung low like bruises. The forecast called for 12. They got more than 2 feet. A fierce 3-day blizzard slammed the mountains, with whiteout conditions and sub-zero temperatures. The wind roared down the chimney and pressed against the windows like an angry beast. Trees bowed under the weight of the snow, and icicles formed overnight on the eaves, growing longer by the hour. Travel was impossible. Even walking to the end of the driveway felt like crossing an Arctic wasteland. Alex stayed inside, tending the fireplace and worrying. He thought of those cubs every hour. When the skies finally cleared, a deep stillness settled over the Montana forest, the kind of stillness that arrives only after a storm has spent itself. Sunlight glinted off drifts that had sculpted themselves into strange new Shapes across the landscape. Alex, layered on insulated gear, strapped snowshoes to his boots, and stepped into a world remade by snow and silence. The cold bit at his face, but the air was clearer than it had been in days. He moved slowly, pressing a path through waist-deep snow toward the clearing, where the small shelter stood, his breath fogging with each exhale. Reaching the shelter, he paused to examine the surroundings. The roof had held, which relieved him, but the snow banked up around the entrance concerned him. He crouched and brushed it away with gloved hands, then gently pulled back the makeshift flap of canvas he'd secured over the opening. The straw inside had been disturbed. Clumps of fur clung to the bedding, and faint impressions of a curled body remained in the flattened straw. Someone had been here recently, but there were no new tracks leading away. Alex frowned and scanned the perimeter. The wind during the blizzard had likely erased any prints that might have told a clearer story. He pulled a sealed bag of chicken scraps from his pack and set it near the shelter, not inside. Still cautious not to disrupt whatever instincts kept the cubs wary but alive. Then he trudged back to the porch, his limbs aching from the cold and the weight of the snow, and waited. That night the wind died completely. The trees stopped creaking. It was the kind of calm that seemed unnatural after 3 days of howling fury. Alex sat with a cup of broth by the window, staring at the clearing now, bathed in blue-white moonlight. Hours passed, then movement. First it was just a shadow shifting along the edge of the trees, a silhouette too low to be a deer, too smooth to be a fox. The older cub emerged slowly, not with the usual caution, but with urgency. His steps were uneven. It moved erratically, nose to the ground, searching. Then it broke from its usual path and turned toward the cabin. Alex stood, heart pounding. He moved toward the door, but didn't open it yet. The cub climbed onto the porch for the first time. It looked straight at the door, ears twitching, body tense but unafraid. Then it stepped aside and something small behind it stumbled into view. A bundle of fur, darker than the snow around it, collapsed halfway to the doormat. The younger sibling, Leo, Alex would later call him, was barely more than a whisper of life. His hind leg twisted at a sickening angle. Blood had frozen into patches along his flank. His breathing was shallow, chest rising in tiny, ragged intervals. The older cub stood over him protectively for a moment, then backed away a few paces, watching Alex. Alex opened the door just enough to lean out and assess the situation without alarming either animal. His breath up. The older cub didn't flee. Stood still, eyes locked with his. Something desperate but clear behind that golden gaze. "You want me to help?" Alex whispered, the words barely audible. In the cold air, his heart hammered. He moved slowly back inside, grabbed his phone and called the only person he could think of who might have an answer. Dr. James Maruin, the wildlife biologist he'd worked with years ago on a documentary about mountain lions and conservation patterns in northern forests. "James, I've got a situation," he said when the line picked up. "You won't believe it. A bobcat cub brought its injured brother to my porch. It's alive, but just barely." There was a pause. Then James said, calm and steady, "Do you have a carrier?" "Gloves?" "Yes," Alex replied, Heavy ones. I've used them before. You'll need to get him secured, warm, and to a vet as soon as roads are passable. I'll call ahead. There's a wildlife vet named Dr. Caesar in Great Falls. He'll be ready. Alex hung up and moved with speed he didn't know he still had. He grabbed thick leather gloves, a soft towel, and the old pet carrier from the shed he used for transporting wounded birds in the past. Stepping out onto the porch, he saw the older cub, still there, paws planted in the snow, sides rising and falling quickly but steadily. He spoke softly, voice low and even. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'll be gentle." He crouched beside the younger cub and wrapped the towel around the limp body. The warmth of the towel against the ice-crusted fur released a faint whimper from the cub, too weak to resist. Alex could feel the bones beneath the skin, the terrifying lightness of the young body in his arms. The older cub let out a soft, low growl. Not threatening, not aggressive, but full of grief. Alex met his gaze. "I'll take care of him. I promise." He placed the bundled Leo into the carrier, latched it, then turned back toward the door. The older cub didn't follow, but stood watching, unmoving. Alex hesitated. "I won't let you down." The 3-hour drive to the wildlife center in Great Falls was slow. Every mile a test of nerves. Ice clung to the curves of the road. Snow drifts narrowed the lanes. Alex kept one hand near the carrier, speaking to Leo whenever the cub stirred. "Hang on, little guy. Your brother trusted me. I'm not letting you down." Dr. Caesar was waiting when they arrived, standing just inside the rear entrance of the wildlife clinic, already wearing gloves and a protective gown. The center, though small, hummed with quiet urgency. Metal tables, overhead lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the sharp, clean chill of sterilized air. Alex carried the crate through a side corridor, every step echoing. Leo hadn't moved much during the drive, except for one short whimper near the halfway point. Now he was silent again, curled in the corner of the towel, his chest barely rising. Caesar opened the crate carefully, then lifted Leo with practiced gentleness. "We've got him," he said as 2 techs joined him. They disappeared into the treatment room. Alex was left in the small waiting lounge, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, floor tiles scrubbed too many times, and a table stacked with wildlife newsletters and outdated conservation brochures. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than it should. He stood, paced, sat again. The adrenaline had faded and left a cold ache behind, fatigue in his shoulders, and something heavier pressing in his chest. He didn't realize he had drifted off until the sound of a door clicking open pulled him upright. Dr. Caesar re-entered, his expression serious, but not grim. "Compound fracture in the hind leg," he said. "Signs of frostbite and malnutrition. But he's young. He has a good chance." Alex stood. "Will he walk again?" "If we stabilize the leg and start a feeding regimen now, yes, he's resilient. But the bigger question is, will he ever be wild again?" Alex didn't answer right away. He looked toward the treatment door, imagining Leo lying there, surrounded by unfamiliar smells and lights. He had never thought that far ahead. Survival was the only thing that mattered. But now that Leo might live, the future had to be considered. He stayed at a roadside motel that night. A humble one-story place with cracked stucco walls and faded curtains. The heater clanked when it turned on. The smell of pine cleaner lingered faintly in the air. He pulled the extra blanket tight over his shoulders and called Adam. "Leo," he said when his son picked up, "that's what I've started calling him." "Is he going to make it?" "They think so. He's fighting. The fracture's bad and he was in rough shape, but they're hopeful." There was a pause on the other. "And what about the older one?" Alex stared at the ceiling, at the WAT stain that spread like branches of a winter tree. "Still out there. I don't know what he thinks, but he watched me take Leo away. He didn't run. He just stayed until I drove off." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Over the next month, Alex visited the center regularly. The trip between his cabin and the clinic became a routine he navigated with quiet discipline. 3 hours each way, sometimes through icy roads, sometimes through slush or thaw. But he came always. He watched Leo gain weight, slowly but steadily. The protruding ribs smoothed over with muscle and fur. His eyes, once dull and half-closed from pain, began to track movement again. He stood eventually on 3 legs, then slowly started to test the 4th, still encased in a padded cast. The staff limited human contact as much as possible, but the damage was done. Leo had been handled too often during those critical early days. He no longer flinched from human voices or movement. He didn't fear people, and that Alex understood was a problem. Dr. Caesar explained it clearly. He's bonded to humans now, maybe too much. If we release him, he may approach people looking for help or worse, food. That's dangerous for him and for others. So, what happens? Alex asked, though he was starting to understand the direction of the conversation. "We find a sanctuary," Caesar replied. "Somewhere he can live in safety in an enclosure designed for animals like him." Or he hesitated slightly. "You apply to keep him as a licensed wildlife caretaker. You've already got the land, the training, background, the space. I know you've raised Adam right, and that counts." Alex stared out the window of the recovery wing. Snow still clung to the ground beneath the trees. The clouds were low, heavy with the promise of more. "I made a promise," he said quietly, "to the cub who asked me to save his brother." Dr. Caesar looked at him, thoughtful. "Then maybe it's time to keep that promise in a new way." Over the following weeks, Alex applied to the Montana Wildlife Home Rehabilitation Program. He completed the coursework, built a natural enclosure with climbing rocks, trees, and even a shallow stream. He documented his property, created emergency plans, and consulted with Dr. Marin on environmental enrichment. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, the older bobcat cub, now approaching adulthood, returned regularly. Alex would see him from the porch, standing near the place where Leo had last lain. Sometimes he would sit 4 hours. Alex would speak softly. "He's healing. He's safe. I'll take care of him." The bobcat never approached the cabin again, but lingered nearby, a silent observer of a human world he didn't quite trust, but didn't fear either. By April, the enclosure was finished. The final inspection came and passed. The license was approved. Leo came home. Alex didn't sleep the night before. He stood at the enclosure with the crate beside him. When the door opened, Leo hesitated, then stepped into the space, moving with familiar grace. The limp was barely visible. His coat had thickened, and his eyes shone gold. In the Montana light, he explored the enclosure slowly, sniffing the air, dipping a paw into the stream, scaling a fallen log. When he finally sat, it was near the eastern side, facing the woods. Alex knew he was waiting, and 2 nights later, the older bobcat returned. This time, he didn't stop at the clearing's edge. He approached the mesh boundary, and Leo was already there watching. They locked eyes. No sound, no movement, just recognition. Alex stood on the porch, breath caught in his chest. The older bobcat sat just outside the enclosure, and Leo mirrored him. They stayed that way for nearly an hour. Then the visitor rose and padded back into the forest. The pattern continued. Once every few nights, the older bobcat would return. He never entered the cabin's range, never came for food, just watched. Leo always met him at the fence, whether it was memory, instinct, or something deeper. Alex couldn't say, but he felt peace watching them. By summer, the visits grew fewer. The older cub, now fully grown, had likely carved out his own territory. He would one day disappear entirely into the wilderness, as all wild things must, but Leo remained. Alex still followed every wildlife regulation, never hand-fed him, never coddled him, but he spoke often, shared the stories, and felt less alone. In the silence of the forest, Adam came. More often, too, drawn by the quiet strength of the bond that had changed their lives. Sometimes father and son would sit together at dusk, watching Leo bask in the last light of the day. "You did more than keep a promise," Adam said once. "You made a home." Alex nodded, eyes on the golden cat resting on sun-warmed stone. Maybe he saved me, too. And in that quiet part of the Montana wilderness, where solitude shaped life, and choices echoed beyond the visible world, a man, a cub, and a silent watcher was a story of trust that neither snow nor silence could erase.